Michael E Brown is not a name one would necessarily choose for a man destined to change the world. And indeed, Brown himself betrays few of the personality traits typical of your standard world changer. From the belligerent Galileo to the vengeful Newton, the tyrannical Leverrier to the neglectful Einstein, most people who set out to change the world appear driven by an abject hatred of the world as it stands. Not so Mike Brown, whose contentment with his lot appears shockingly genuine. By all accounts, including my own, as I have had extensive email discussions with him, he is open, friendly, soft-spoken, and eternally eager to pass on his knowledge to the wider world. But yes, he would still change the wider world, even if you would probably argue that he didn't. Despite what his Twitter handle may say, Brown did not set out to kill Pluto. He simply wanted to find a planet. Like Charles Cowell and David Jewett before him, Brown had little actual evidence to support his quest, merely a deep inner conviction that this is how the universe must be. In an odd sense, Brown was born in space. Huntsville, Alabama, was the center of rocket construction for the space race, which, when he was born, was in full swing. As he put it, at that time, everyone living there was either a rocket engineer's wife, or a rocket engineer's child. Unlike his most obvious progenitor, Clyde Tombaugh, Brown learned early on that, thanks to some baroque attempts at model airplanes, he wasn't destined to be a combination of visionary scientist and hard-scrabble mechanic. Nor was he particularly interested in the night sky. His father had once dragged him out of bed to see Comet Kohatek. Young Mike saw a smudge in the dark and then went back to sleep. What he was interested in was planets, and from the NASA posters on his wall as a kid, all the way to college, finding and scrutinizing these strange new worlds would be the driving force of his life. In 1992, while still a graduate student at Berkeley, he bumped into fellow student Jane Liu, who whispered to him, "Nobody knows yet, but we just found the Kuiper Belt." "Wow!" he responded. "What's the Kuiper Belt?" He would soon learn, and as discovery piled on discovery, he noted that the sizes of the objects were gradually increasing. By 1999, the largest identified KBOs were approaching 20% the size of Pluto, and it seemed only a matter of time before one was found that exceeded Pluto in size. And if such an object did exist, what else could one call it but a planet? Mike Brown's field of interest at the time, to which he occasionally still returns, was the moons of Jupiter. But as he sat beneath Palomar Observatory's Hale telescope one night at the end of 1999 with a fellow astronomer named Sabine Ariot, he decided to change track. And to do so, he drew on a common motivational tactic for scientists who believe they are on the verge of groundbreaking discoveries. He made a bet. 5 bottles of good champagne if he found an object bigger than Pluto by the end of 2004. Sabine took the bet, and the hunt was on. For Brown, there was only one tool capable of performing such a task, the 48-inch Schmidt-type Samuel Ocean telescope at Palomar, the very same telescope that Charles Cowell had used to find Chiron 2 decades earlier. Unlike nearly all other telescopes of the time, the Ocean still used antiquated photographic plates to capture its images, the same method Clyde Tombaugh had used to find Pluto in 1930. Why would Brown want to use antiquated plates? Because they had one crucial advantage over more sensitive digital cameras. They were huge. To cover the same breadth of the sky digitally would require a 500-megapixel camera, a vertiginous number even today, let alone in 1999. More importantly, the Ocean was soon to be left idle for the foreseeable future, giving Brown an unlimited supply of that one commodity most coveted by astronomers: time. Astronomers are happy to get days per year on a major telescope. At the Ocean, Brown had years of his own to work with. There was only one problem. Mike hadn't handled film since 3rd grade. Luckily, he didn't have to. The assistants at Palomar were only too happy to do the dirty work at the business end of the telescope while he got on with the business of being an astronomy professor. The final tally of images for the project totaled 239 fields, covering 1/3 of the zodiac. The sample contained 100 times as many stars as Tombaugh's. To search that using a blink comparator would have taken 40 years. Instead, each of the plates was digitally scanned and handed to a computer program that Brown had spent a year writing to do the job of spotting moving objects. In the end, the program offered up a list of 8,761 possibles, all but 27 of which could be excluded off the bat. In the fall of 2001, Mike took a sheaf of 27 maybes to the Palomar Observatory's 60-inch telescope to be properly scrutinized with a digital camera. The process was long, and halfway through he was beginning to lose hope. He did manage to sound hopeful to a group to whom he gave a lecture that month. He certainly impressed the group's director, since she married him shortly after. That was compensation enough for when all his potential planets were revealed as illusions. He would start again. In 2001, the Palomar-Schmidt telescope was finally upgraded with a digital camera. It had only 1/12 the coverage, but it was 3 times more sensitive, and also meant that what originally could only have been done in 20 minutes could now be done in 1. After re-examining the previously viewed region with the more sensitive instruments, and finding, to no small satisfaction, that they were indeed empty of moving objects, Brown and his team, which largely comprised him and Chad Trujillo, a recent graduate who had worked with Jewett and Liu and done his dissertation on finding Kuiper Belt objects, turned to previously unexplored territory. And on June 2, 2002, Trujillo announced to Brown that he had found an object bigger than Pluto. Brown prefers to learn as much as possible about a newly discovered object before announcing it to the world. The most defining attribute of any trans-Neptunian object is its orbit, but Object X, for what else were they going to call it, could only be traced back 3 years in the digital archives. To determine its orbit would require pre-covery images from decades earlier. It was then that Trujillo had suggested examining Charles Kowal's plates. This hadn't occurred to Brown, partly because he preferred not to think of the man who had searched for Planet X and failed. If Kowal had snapped Object X, would he not have found it? Not necessarily. Kowal was working with a blink comparator and unwieldy photographic plates. Even if he captured it, it was entirely possible he failed to spot it. So Brown went looking. In a scene more reminiscent of archaeology than astronomy, he was led by Jean Muller, one of the team who had aided him during his first planet search at Palomar, into the dusty, chaotic archive of the Palomar telescope, where she located Kowal's plates, completely out of their assigned place. Unfortunately, Palomar didn't have a blink comparator anymore, so Brown was reduced to the position of Percival Lowell, frantically skipping between one plate and another, relying on memory to blink the image in his mind. Even though he knew what he was looking for, and had confined himself to a postage stamp-sized search area, locating Object X still took him 30 solid minutes. But it was there. They now had Object X's orbit, and in most respects, with its 295-year orbital period, modest inclination, its orbit was about half as tilted as Pluto's, it was a fairly typical inhabitant of the main region of the Kuiper Belt. Except that it was big. But bigger than Pluto? Brown had some time reserved at the giant Keck telescope for a different project, but thankfully, once you have a reservation, no one really cares what you do with it. So he went to Mauna Kea and spent the night looking at Object X through the near-perfect atmospheric conditions. He'd also managed to finagle a few minutes on the Hubble, and those images revealed that Object X was about half the size of Pluto. Turns out Brown and Trujillo had been fooled by its unusual brightness into thinking it was larger than it actually was. Still, Object X was a major shift in the outer solar system's geography. Nothing that large had been found in the solar system since Pluto. All of a sudden, Pluto wasn't the overwhelming ruler of his domain. He had contenders. Brown decided that Object X needed a more dignified name, and chose Quawar, the creator god of the Tongva tribe indigenous to the area around Pasadena, where it was discovered. In a moment of uncharacteristic brashness, Brown informed the Birmingham News that Quawar, quote, was a big icy nail in the coffin of Pluto as a planet. A bit premature, perhaps, but as we shall see, not wrong. At this point, new discoveries dried up, and Brown entered the familiar stage of wondering whether to go on. Even so, this time saw his team gain a new member, David Rabinowitz, the discoverer of the Centaur Pholus, who had made a name for himself at the asteroid survey Spacewatch. And then, on the 11th of November 2003, Brown found Sedna. Named by Brown after the Inuit goddess of the frigid Arctic Ocean, Sedna not only added to the growing list of objects approaching Pluto in size — it is slightly smaller than Quawar and slightly larger than the largest asteroid series — but completely shattered previous preconceptions of what a solar system object could be. In fact, Sedna's discovery was so utterly world-altering that I won't discuss it here. You'll have to wait for the final episode. But one thing about Sedna's discovery sent Brown into a panic. It had been so far away and moving so slowly that his computer almost failed to capture it. Clearly, he needed to upgrade his software to higher sensitivities. It would, of course, mean a far larger number of false positives, but he didn't care. It was already February of 2004. He was running out of time to win his bet. He spent hours a day going after false positive in his old data, day after day, month after month, certain that he must have missed something significant, but finding nothing. And then, on December 27, 2004, 4 days before his bet was set to expire, Brown found another large object, which he nicknamed Santa in honor of the season. Thanks to the timely discovery of a small moon in orbit around it, which he nicknamed Rudolph, Brown and his team were able to calculate Santa's mass. At this point, Brown was too jaded to assume it was larger than Pluto, and indeed it wasn't, though it was still the largest object they'd found so far, about the size of Pluto's moon Charon. Bizarrely, Santa's rapid rotation had stretched it into the shape of a cigar. Brown took his time gathering this information before announcing Santa's discovery. This would prove to be a mistake, though he would not immediately realize it. Pluto may have gathered a sizable court, but he was still not dethroned. On January 1, 2005, Brown conceded his bet and purchased the 5 bottles of champagne, with the intention of sending them off, presumably with a very humble note attached, to Sabine Herriot. 4 days later, the champagne still unsent, he received an automatic notification from the computer program he designed to locate potentially interesting objects. By his own account, upon glancing at it, he almost fell out of his chair. For a quiet, soft-spoken man, Mike Brown has a flair for the dramatic, and his email to David Rabinowitz and Chad Trujillo has entered solar system history. Subject: Why we get up in the morning. New bright object. Please sit down and take a deep breath. Mag equals 18.8. Making it brighter than anything else out there except Santa. Distance equals 120 AU. And by the way, if you move Pluto to 120 AU, it would be about mag equals 19.7. Mag, in this case, meant apparent magnitude, i.e., how bright it appeared from Earth. Like nearly everything in astronomy, it is measured backwards, so the brighter an object is, the lower its magnitude number. There are 3 things that affect an object's apparent magnitude: how far away it is, how reflective it is, and how large it is. Brown had miscalculated the object's distance. It was actually about 97 AU away, or 3 times Pluto's distance from the Sun. But the principle still held. If Pluto, the last planet, were placed at a similar distance, it would be twice as dim. So if this object were as reflective as Pluto, it would have to be larger. In fact, if this object possessed 100% albedo, or reflected every glint of light shone on it, a trait known to no substance in the universe, then, according to his calculations, it would still be larger than Pluto. The usurper had arrived at the gate. The next email Brown composed was far shorter, and it was to Sabine Herriot. "Would you be willing to grant me a 5-day extension on our bet?" he asked. Graciously, if unwisely, she assented. Brown would ultimately find himself the proud owner of 10 bottles of champagne. 5 meant for Herriot, 5 gifted by her. An outcome he considered perfectly agreeable. This was it. After 5 years of searching, Brown had found the object of his quest. It was either a new planet or the end of planet Pluto. He and his team had kept a name on ice for just this object, should it ever be found. A feminine name, to give company to Venus among the sausage fests of the Planetary Club. A name that was born of mythology, kind of. And, most importantly, began with the eternally resonant letter X. It was never intended to be the object's actual name, of course, but due to the maelstrom which its discovery would unleash, would become its de facto name for over a year, an outcome Brown only slightly regrets. But for now, thanks to Brown's penchant for secrecy, the name remained a shibboleth between the trio who knew of its existence and Brown's wife Diane, to whom he told everything. If that wasn't enough, 3 months later, on March 31st, 2005, they found another object brighter than any they had found, which they, true to form, named Easter Bunny. Easter Bunny turned out to be slightly smaller than Pluto, not that it mattered. His life briefly upended by the birth of his daughter, Brown intended to publish full articles on Santa, Easter Bunny, and Xena the following September. But on July 27, 2005, Brown received an email from a NASA official that would soon force him to show his hand far earlier than he had intended. The official had, all unknowing, asked Brown for information about K40506A. What? That was the code string his computer automatically assigned to his new discoveries. K for Kuiper, 4 for 2004, 0506 for May 6th, and A because it was the first to be found that day. It represented the object he called Santa. But how could anyone have known that code? After glancing online, Brown concluded that the code had been posted a day or 2 before in notification of talks his team were to give on that object in September. An even more perplexing email arrived soon after. claiming that a team in Spain had located Santa and claimed discovery. Brown was deflated, but accepted defeat. Priority should always go to the first to announce, regardless of who initially discovered the object. Even while the media reveled in tales of an astronomical rumble, Brown refused to pick up the gauntlet. He even wrote a congratulatory letter to the project leader, José Luis Ortiz, conceding his title. But Brian Marsden, ever the solar system's vigilant file-keeper, was suspicious. He asked Brown if there was any chance that someone could have located Santa's position using only Brown's computer code. "Of course not," Brown responded. "The code was unique to his computer and contained no positional information." Still, it was odd. Odd enough for Brown to wonder if he might be wrong. Unable to sleep, he turned on his computer and Googled K40506A. Scrolling down past the frantic news articles, he found a website by the builder of a telescope in Chile, a telescope that Chad Trujillo had used to track Santa. The builder's website was designed to keep track of everything the telescope was now doing. If you scanned the logs for any unfamiliar object, movements could be tracked as if you were doing them observing yourself. It was, for all intents and purposes, a planet discovery simulator. Anyone could look up the site, follow the movement, and claim to have made the observations themselves. Brown did not initially suspect a fraud. What sent him into a panic was that once they knew of one of his team's discoveries, they could follow the team's observations for all the other objects they had yet to announce, including Xena. There was only one thing to be done. He had to call a press conference and announce the discovery of a potential 10th planet as soon as possible, which meant 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. A dead zone for news. His contacts told him he was nuts, but he did it anyway. It was at this point that, thanks to an impromptu chat with an old college friend at the New York Times, the informal name of Xena entered the public consciousness. With Xena and Easter Bunny now public, Brown began receiving notifications from all over the scientific world, including Rick Pogue, the maintainer of the website that had recorded Santa's movements. After first assuring Brown that he had beefed up the page's security to prevent such a thing occurring again, he then informed him that, after a little digital detective work, he had found that the same observatory used by the Spanish team had accessed the site 2 days before they announced the discovery of Santa. Thanking Pogue profusely, Brown immediately called Marsden. "I knew it!" Marsden snorted, and cross-checked the IP addresses to emails he had received. It showed that the computers that had accessed the site belonged to members of the Spanish team, including Ortiz himself. This wasn't exactly holding the knife, but it was close. After a strongly worded, for Brown, letter to Ortiz failed to elicit a response, he wrote another, more detailed letter to Ortiz's boss, who was more forthcoming, begging him not to let the controversy tarnish the university. Brown sent an even more detailed letter to Ortiz, and, after a month, Ortiz fired back, spitting vitriol about how Brown's withholding his discovery was a menace to science. I wish I could say that there was an easy, simple end to this story, but there wasn't. Ortiz never denied checking the site's logs, but claimed to have done so afterwards to confirm his discovery. Eventually, the Committee on Small Body Nomenclature held a vote between the two teams' proposed names and, by a single vote, went with that chosen by Brown's team, Haumea, after a Hawaiian fertility goddess, while the Spanish observatory was named as the discovery location, and the name of the discoverer was left blank. Brian Marsden, perhaps surprisingly, was fairly sanguine about the whole affair. "Sooner or later, posterity will realize what happened," he told the New Scientist, "and Mike Brown will get full credit." Incidentally, Easter Bunny was eventually named Maki Maki, after the creator god of Easter Island. But that controversy was nothing compared to what was coming. Brown's discoveries and explorations were doing wonders for future generations of science textbook illustrators, but they had sent the normally staid IAU into something approaching an existential crisis. They knew they would eventually have to name Brown's troublesome Xena, but centuries of practice had placed them in a trap they could not escape. Minor planets had numerical designations appended to their names, like 4 Vesta, 944 Hidalgo, or 2060 Chiron. Major planets did not. To name this object required determining if it was a planet or not, which meant defining what a planet actually was. This wasn't fair. Geologists had got by for years using words like continental crust or continental drift without having to ask themselves what a continent was. As if to set fire under them, in September 2005, Brown identified a moon around Xena, nicknamed, of course, Gabrielle, that allowed him to show conclusively that it was a full 27% more massive than Pluto. They weren't getting out of this, whatever they tried. To be fair, it's not like they didn't see this coming. In 2003, after the discovery of Sedna, the IAU convened a 19-member committee to draft a workable definition of planet. The committee included Brian Marsden, Pluto's bête noire, and Alan Stern, Pluto's most ardent knight, who had campaigned for years, and ultimately successfully, to get a probe sent there. As if to further ensure there could be no consensus, the IAU allowed each member of the committee to vote for as many options as they liked. The options were: 1. A planet is any object in orbit around the Sun with a diameter greater than 2,000 kilometers. 11 votes in favor. Option 2. A planet is any object in orbit around the Sun whose shape is stable due to its own gravity. 8 votes in favor. Option 3. A planet is any object in orbit around the Sun that is dominant in its immediate neighborhood. 6 votes in favor. The first definition was essentially a cultural one, defining planet in the same arbitrary way that we define a continent. If it feels like one, it probably is one. The second option defined a planet as an individual geological entity. The third viewed a planet as a component of a wider whole. It is interesting that in this first round, the arbitrary cultural definition got the most votes, almost as if they wanted to shut the whole kerfuffle down. It didn't work. With no clear winner emerging in the first round, the IAU went for broke, declaring that they would hold a general vote on the definition at their next triennial conference, to be held in Prague in August 2006. This time, there would be consensus. To ensure it, the new committee would comprise 7 members, not 19, and include no one personally invested in Pluto's honor or identity. The 7 were chosen from an admirably diverse range of countries, including the US, the UK, France, and Japan, and included one ambassador from among the undoctorated masses, popular science historian Davis Sobel. Rather shockingly, the 7 were able to come to a conclusion without much disagreement. Could it really have been that simple? Nope. When the 7's final proposal was put before the 2,400 astronomers at the Congress, it was met with, at best, bemusement. It was, in essence, an expanded take on the second option, a planet defined as an individual physical entity. In full, the definition was: a planet is a celestial body that A. has sufficient mass for its self-gravity to overcome rigid body forces so that it assumes a hydrostatic equilibrium or nearly round shape, and B. is in orbit around a star and is neither a star nor a satellite of a planet. Taken as was, that definition was unobjectionable. It meant that not only would Pluto and Xena be planets, but any other of Brown's children in the Kuiper Belt that could be shown to be round. Additionally, it meant that the largest asteroid, Ceres, which is round, would be promoted, or rather reinstated, to planethood. But the 7's list of confirmed planets contained one rather quirky member, Charon. Wait, Charon? What was a moon doing in a list of planets? Well, I should explain here that Charon and Pluto are in no ordinary relationship. Charon is so large in proportion to Pluto that it doesn't technically orbit it. Rather, both objects orbit a common center of mass between them. To envision this, imagine a double-ended baton spinning through the air, but with only the ends visible. Since neither can be said to orbit the other, both could therefore be considered planets. This was, to put it mildly, problematic. What if, for instance, an object were discovered with a satellite in an orbit so eccentric that it sometimes met the planetary definition and other times not? Our moon is expected to shift into a Charon-like orbit in about 50 billion years. Did that make it a not-quite planet? The 7's definition, and its inclusion of Charon in particular, went down like a lead balloon. When a straw poll was conducted to test the waters, 18 voted in favor, 50 against. A counterinsurgency was quickly forming, led by none other than Julio Fernandez, the astronomer who had first proposed the existence of the Kuiper Belt a quarter century earlier. Fernandez had authored a radically different proposal, one that knocked Pluto from its planetary perch. Their proposed definition was: a planet is a celestial body that A. is by far the largest object in its local population, B. has sufficient mass for its self-gravity to overcome rigid body force so that it assumes a hydrostatic equilibrium or nearly round shape, C. does not produce energy by any nuclear fusion mechanism. Objects that fulfill criteria B and C, but not criterion A, are defined as dwarf planets. This was, in effect, an expanded version of the third option, one that saw a planet as a component of a wider whole. The term dwarf planet was coined by Alan Stern as a means to keep the door of the planetary club open to Pluto. Fernandez, who wanted Pluto out, preferred the term planetoid, but Stern's phrase won out. The IAU's final draft proposal followed Fernandez's template almost to the letter, retaining Stern's term dwarf planet. However, a final amendment, passed by unanimous vote in the Congress on the 24th of August, specified that dwarf planets were not to be considered planets. And with that, planet Pluto was gone. The day of Pluto's inclusion on the list of minor planets happened to also be Brian Marsden's last day as head of the Minor Planet Center. "Pluto and I were retired on the same day, you might say," he joked later. Marsden granted Pluto the minor planet number 134340, in retaliation, some believe, for the times he tried to give it a more memorable one and had been shot down. If it was the last thing he did, he was going to put an asteroid number on Pluto, said Annette Tombaugh. And it was the last thing he did. The 2006 IAU Congress is often portrayed by Plutophiles as a callous, calculated judgment passed down by an unfeeling elite from their ivory tower. But it wasn't like that at all. It was a furious, impassioned, and often loud debate between deeply held scientific perspectives, often defining entire livelihoods and even identities. People sought to preserve the honor of their discipline, their planet, and Clyde Tombaugh, whose ashes were then en route to his peculiar world on board the New Horizons spacecraft. At its core, the planet debate was not about Plutophiles versus Plutophobes, or Americans versus the rest of the world, or scientists versus the general public. At its core, the debate was between dynamic physicists and geophysicists, or, more generally, between astronomers and planetary scientists. For millennia, the study of planets had been the sole domain of astronomers. Even during the age of Schiaparelli, when telescopes were finally revealing planets as dynamic worlds with seasonal variations and permanent physical features, the idea that they could be understood as our own Earth was, as geological entities deformed and reshaped by physical processes, was confined to the visions of men like Percival Lowell. And then, in the 1960s, everything changed. A new tool, the space probe, allowed us to bypass the telescope and view these objects directly as living worlds, with storms, craters, canyons, and mountains. With this flood of data came a brand new scientific discipline, planetary science. Most planetary scientists are not astronomers, but geologists. They neither publish in astronomical journals nor, very often, belong to the IAU. While ever-improving telescope technology is gradually merging the two professions together, astronomers still possess a far more holistic view of the solar system than planetary scientists. The finer details of an object's surface features matter less than its interactions with its wider environment. Its motion, its gravitational effects, and above all, its location, because telescopes must be aligned to find it. To an astronomer, the solar system is just that, a system, with each part playing its role as part of an interconnected whole. In that schema, what was Pluto against the swarm of its fellow Kuiper Belt objects? Pluto was just one, and not even the largest, cog in a machine with 100,000 moving parts. Planetary scientists, conversely, see Pluto not as a distant point, but as a vibrant world with wind and clouds moving over mountains and lakes of ice. To them, the solar system looks more like this, a curiosity cabinet packed with individual worlds, each bursting with its own beauties and mysteries. Alan Stern, head of the New Horizons Pluto mission and supreme advocate for planet Pluto, describes a, quote, Star Trek test for planethood. If an object looks like something that could be orbited by the Starship Enterprise, then it is a planet. It is interesting to note that in Star Trek, solar systems are almost never seen in their entirety. It is also interesting to note that under that definition, our moon would be a planet. Stern has done more than anyone else to keep the debate over Pluto's planethood alive, even this year proposing an alternate definition that would grace our solar system with over 100 planets, including, yes, our moon. It is yet to be taken up. Ultimately, though, neither of these conceptions is wrong, and neither is right. They are simply different ways of viewing the same dataset, informed by the priorities of the individual. To disparage either position as non-scientific, or faulty, or nonsensical, is to miss the point. Neither option is scientific, and both make sense within their own fields of inquiry. Ultimately, the geophysical definition of planet failed not because it was wrong, but because the decision to accept it lay with the International Astronomical Union, and a union of astronomers was pretty much certain to choose the definition that appealed to them. To argue, as Stern has, that planetary science doesn't need astronomy and should go its own way, neglects the very basic fact that without astronomers to find them, these worlds so beloved by planetary scientists would remain in the realm of science fiction. The two disciplines, whatever their feelings toward each other, are joined at the hip. Some have argued that the term planet is defunct, and that it should be left to the astrologers who coined it. I would say rather that it is in flux. Our understanding of planets has transformed beyond recognition in recent years, not only with the discovery of the Kuiper Belt, but with swarms of exoplanets now filling our catalogs, and the discoveries of satellites potentially more Earth-like than Mars. This is not the end. Soon, our understanding will again come into focus, and the term planet will be ripe for revision. And what of Mike Brown? He spent the IAU's Prague Congress on holiday with his family. Or perhaps more accurately, he spent it on the phone. A fluke of time zones meant that he became the unwitting beacon for an information-hungry U.S. media, who, in the wake of the initial draft proposal, were demanding to know how wonderful it felt to be the discoverer of a planet. Brown didn't feel wonderful at all. He had, perhaps somewhat idly, entertained the idea of endorsing the meaningless cultural definition of a planet, the one that said a planet was any object above an arbitrary size that orbited the sun, likely because it meant that he could call himself a planet discoverer. But when the IAU insisted that their definition be scientific, Mike Brown, the astronomer, took over. No, he told the media, he was not the discoverer of a planet, and neither was Clyde Tombaugh. The astronomical definition, which ultimately won out, was the right one. Despite being denied a planet, in fact 3 planets, since Makemake and Haumea were later added to the Dwarf Planet Club, Mike Brown has been admirably consistent in his belief that the IAU's decision to deplanet Pluto was correct. That is not to say that he has been blind to the controversy. When he was finally given the option to name the world so long called Xena, his choice proved another example of the gift for mythic appropriation that would earn him a cult following among astrologers. Xena is now named Eris, after the Greek goddess of discord and strife. But Brown would not stand at having no planets to his name. The swarm of discoveries in the Kuiper Belt had let loose its own menagerie of dragons, and Brown, having caught the scent, was on the hunt. His trophy? A true planet, though he will not call it X. And we shall join the hunt in the final episode.